Chapter 14, Section 2, Early Developments in U.S. Foreign Policy. In 1796, late in his second term as president, George Washington presented his final message to the nation. Although known as Washington's Farewell Address, it was not delivered as a speech, but instead appeared in newspapers. While Washington focused mainly on domestic issues, he ended with a discussion of foreign affairs. "It is our true policy," he said, "to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." These words would shape American foreign policy for more than a century to come. Fundamentals of U.S. foreign policy. From Washington's time to the president has led the way in formulating the nation's foreign policy. The State Department, led by the Secretary of State, advises the president and carries out the details of U.S. policy. Congress also plays a role by debating and voting on foreign policy issues. A treaty with another nation does not become legally binding unless the Senate approves it by a two-thirds vote. Presidents have a variety of tools to use in pursuing foreign policy goals. One is diplomacy, the art of conducting negotiations with other nations. Diplomacy may lead to informal agreements as well as treaties. A second tool is financial aid in the form of grants or loans. Such aid can be used to support friendly nations or influence their policies. A third tool is the threat or the use of armed force. Over the past 2 centuries, 2 schools of thought, known as realism and idealism, have shaped U.S. foreign policy. Realism is based on the belief that relations with other countries should be guided by national self-interest. From this perspective, foreign policy should pursue practical objectives that benefit the American people. Such objectives might include national security, increased trade with other nations, and access to overseas resources. Idealism in foreign policy is based on the belief that values and ideals should influence how countries relate to one another. From this point of view, foreign policy should be used to promote America's founding ideals, particularly democracy, liberty, and rights, to ensure a better world, not just for Americans, but for all people. At any given time, realism or idealism may dominate the country's relations with other nations, but most of the time, U.S. foreign policy reflects a blend of the 2 schools of thought. Washington advocates neutrality and unilateralism. George Washington established 2 key principles of U.S. foreign policy. The first, neutrality, was a response to the outbreak of war between France and Great Britain in 1793. Neutrality is a policy of refusing to take sides among warring nations. Idealists were eager to side with France, pointing out that the United States and France had signed a treaty of alliance during the War of Independence. It was now time, they argued, for the United States to stand by its ally. They were also enthralled by the French Revolution. In 1789, French leaders had issued a statement of revolutionary ideals known as the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. 2 years later, they had abolished France's monarchy and established a republic. Many Americans were eager to support the French in their struggle for liberty. Realists argued against taking sides. They warned that with a tiny army, the United States was ill-prepared for war. Moreover, a British blockade of its ports would cripple an already wobbly economy. Convinced that war would be disastrous for the young nation, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality. It stated that the policy of the United States was to pursue a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent warring powers. In his farewell address, Washington took neutrality a step further. "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is," he advised, "to have with them as little political connection as possible." This advice was translated by presidents who followed Washington into a policy of unilateralism. Under this policy, the United States went it alone in its relations with other countries. It did not seek either military or political alliances with other foreign powers. Defending neutrality, the War of 1812. As a neutral nation, the United States had both rights and duties. It could not give aid to either side in a conflict, nor could it allow a warring nation to use its harbors or territories as a base of operations. In return, the United States also claimed certain rights. One was the right of its citizens to live in peace without fear of attack. A second was a right to trade freely with other nations, including those at war. The seemingly endless war in Europe tested Americans' commitment to neutrality. Both France and Britain seized U.S. ships to prevent goods from reaching the other's ports. Even more alarming, the British began kidnapping American soldiers from U.S. ships, claiming they were deserters from the British Navy. Both the ship's seizures and the kidnappings violated what Americans saw as their rights as citizens of a neutral nation. President John Adams and Thomas Jefferson used every foreign policy tool short of war to defend the right of American ships to trade freely without being attacked. Neither had much success. In 1809, President James Madison took up the challenge of defending neutrality. For a time, he seemed to be making some progress with France. When the British still refused to end attacks on neutral ships, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. The senators and representatives who voted for war did so for a mix of reasons. Those motivated more by idealism cast their votes to defend free trade and sailors' rights. Those motivated mainly by realism believed that a war with Great Britain would give the United States the opportunity to expand its borders into Canada. The War of 1812 lasted more than 2 years. With no victory in sight, peace talks began in Ghent, Belgium in mid-1814. The Treaty of Ghent called for a firm and universal peace between His Britannic Majesty and the United States, but it left the issues that caused the war unresolved. Still, the young nation had stood up to Britain. Not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost, boasted Americans as the war drew to a close. The Monroe Doctrine bans colonization. When James Monroe took office as president in 1817, he faced new challenges. One came from Russia, which already controlled Alaska. In 1821, Russia issued a decree extending its colonies south into territory claimed jointly by the United States and Great Britain. Meanwhile, revolutions were sweeping across Latin America. Americans cheered as one colony after another freed itself from Spain. But rumors soon emerged that Spain meant to recolonize the region. Britain then invited the United States to join it in warning European leaders against taking such action. Monroe chose a more unilateral approach. In a speech to Congress in 1823, he warned that the American continents were closed to future colonization by any European powers. He also stated that the United States would consider European interference in the new Latin American republics as dangerous to our peace and safety. These twin policies of non-colonization and non-interference in the Western Hemisphere became known as the Monroe Doctrine. The United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine only a few times during the 1800s. One of those occasions came about when Venezuela asked for help in settling a long-standing dispute with Britain over its border with British Guyana, a British colony in South America. Venezuela appealed to the United States in the name of the immortal Monroe to intervene. Siding with the Venezuelans, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts warned, "If Great Britain is to be permitted to take the territory of Venezuela, there is nothing to prevent her taking the whole of Venezuela or any other South American state. The supremacy of the Monroe Doctrine should be established, and at once, peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must." Henry Cabot Lodge, North American Review, 1895. Britain agreed to negotiate with Venezuela, but only after deciding that it was not worth going to war with the United States over a few thousand square miles of mosquito-infested jungle. Still, Americans saw the settlement of the Venezuelan boundary dispute as a victory for the Monroe Doctrine. "Never again," crowed the Chicago Journal, "will a European nation put forth claims to American territory without consulting the government of the United States."